If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Campers, rangers, what is the spookiest, strangest thing you've seen in the woods? When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around in the woods behind our house on some Weyerhaeuser timber property and found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was that the house had been left very suddenly. There was still unopened mail and magazines sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to same date in the 1950s. Sheets and blankets still on the beds, clothes still in the drawers, pantry full of canned and jarred food, half of it exploded or leaking after so many years. Dishes in the sink, dishes on the table. Unburned candles still sitting out waiting to be used. A fridge outside full of food that had turned to muck and dust. After exploring the house for a while, we checked out the farm. The chicken coop had dozens of chicken skeletons, wrapped in desiccated skins or picked bare. There were 2 pig skeletons in a pen, and the remains of a horse and several cows in the surrounding pasture. A tractor was parked in the garage and was in great shape for its age. It didn't occur to me as a kid at the time, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was really remarkable that the entire place was undisturbed. There was no vandalism, no sign of entry, and as far as I could tell, we were the first people to set foot in there in 40 years. Following a trail through the snowy woods on a cold winter night. Suddenly, the strong scent of woman's perfume. Just in one particular spot. I was past it before it really registered. That's odd, I thought. I stepped back. Yes, I could smell it. I took another step, the smell was gone. When I stood in one particular spot I could smell it, but one step either way, there was nothing, and the trail did not intersect with another. I stepped off the trail into the deep snow, and sure enough, no scent to the left or the right. The night was still, no wind. A chill went down my spine. By this time I was looking around to see if maybe someone was hurt off the trail, or even if there was a body nearby. I called out. No response, called again, listening carefully. And I stood there, wondering what to do. And then I carried on, with my hair standing up on my neck, looking back over my shoulder. You know what? I just realized I never looked up in the trees. Was on an overnight campout at a summer camp when I was around 10. Rather than having tents for the campers, we just laid out sleeping bags under tarps set up like lean-tos. In the middle of the night I heard heavy footsteps in the brush near our campsite. I thought maybe it was our counselor's black lab. Suddenly a mag light shines out from one of the other lean-tos. One of my cabin mates has heard it too. I see him searching his light over the ground, and catch glimpses of something darting through the woods. Finally it stops, he focuses the light on it, and it's a wild turkey. I think how that's interesting. When the turkey suddenly charges the lean-to, the mag light starts shining wildly around the woods as my cabin mate screams in terror. This is mixed with the outraged gobble, gobble, gobble from the turkey attacking him. I'm too stunned to move, and after about 20 seconds it's over as quickly as it began. Next morning I've convinced myself it was all a dream. I'm sitting at the campfire's remains with the other early risers about to recount the crazy dream I had. Just as I'm about to start, the cabin mate with the mag light walks up, hair completely disheveled, scratches on his face and arms, saying, "You are not going to believe what happened to me last night." Doing a big hike in Utah on a camping weekend. Friend and I were doing a day hike during a camping trip in a pretty remote area of national forest. We got off course with a side trail about halfway into the hike for fun, probably 7 to 8 miles in the forest, and out of nowhere there's an open flat patch with roughly 15 teens dancing in unison wearing very odd matching clothes. There's a couple adults standing around in the same attire and they're playing some very weird, almost enchanted music. The path is designed to walk straight to them and it's somewhat thick otherwise, so it's not like we can just avoid them. Before we even started discussing what the hell is going on or what to do, they in unison freeze and stare at us. The music stops. One of the adults starts banging a drum slowly, one beat at a time, and the group stands up straight and continues staring at us. No words were spoken, and my buddy and I turned and ran the duck back as fast as we could to the main trail, which mind you took some time being a few miles off the real trail. We never looked back until we got on the main trail. Saw nothing, but my God were we terrified. When we finally got back to our car, in the distance we saw one of the adults in that matching outfit standing at the tree line watching us. So he followed us a good 8 to 10 miles. That ended the camping trip. Went back to our site, packed and left. Camping out in Uwharrie after a full day of trail riding, I heard red coyotes howling in the distance. Over the next 3 hours, that howling got closer, entered the camp, then departed. We knew what they were, and that they're skittish, but it was one of those moments where you can kind of see a rain cloud fast approaching. You know it's just water and it won't hurt you, but your body tenses up as you desperately search for cover. I'm sure I have more experiences, but I always cancel them out in my head because, believe it or not, a lot of those creepy noises in the woods are typically just a rock falling under its own weight or some random nocturnal creature who wants nothing to do with you. Or, it's Bigfoot. Earlier this summer I was hiking in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. A couple days into my trip I got really sick. Sore throat, headache, fatigue, loss of appetite. About the worst cocktail of symptoms for hiking long distance. I had found a tick on me and I was terrified that I might have Lyme disease. I decided to get off trail and see a doctor, which is easier said than done in the most remote, inaccessible section of the whole Appalachian Trail. Thankfully, there are old logging roads which crisscross the wilderness, so I decided to turn off onto a road which, I was told, led to a campground. There I hoped to find some day hikers and get a ride into town. As soon as I turned off the it started pouring rain, which only increased my misery. A few minutes later I noticed a dog in the woods. Strange, I thought. Then I saw another dog. And another, and another. About a dozen big hunting hounds, fenced off, randomly in the middle of nowhere, Maine. They barked at me, slavering, and pawed at the chicken wire fence, which did not seem strong enough to contain them. This was slightly disconcerting, but the brown trouser moment came when I spotted a lone figure in the woods, what seemed like a tall man in a hooded blue rain jacket and pants. I couldn't see his face, and he just stood there, still as a statue. Severely spooked, I hiked out of there on the double. In the backcountry it's generally good manners to say hello and exchange pleasantries, but this guy didn't say a word. Maybe it was because of the rain, maybe he was feeding bodies to his hounds out there, I may never know. But he definitely saw me, and I could tell that he was watching me go past. I was traveling/backpacking Koreok style for more than 3 years. English isn't my first language. Creepiest thing I encountered on the road was a ghost village in Turkey. We were traveling in a group, with a dog, some chickens and a mule. No joke. The village we came to was totally abandoned, old houses, made from natural stones, not even bricks. All clothes, food, furniture and everything was still there. Some of the houses had plates, forks and stuff on the table, as if a family was just about to have dinner. It wasn't just one house though. It was a whole village's. Valuables still there, food in the shelves, crops hanging to dry and all that. Nobody took any of the furniture, looked like all the village left in a terrible rush, very suddenly. We stayed for about a week, nobody really dared to sleep in the houses, so we slept outside except 2 of us. The more we saw and realized how creepy the village really was, the happier we were about the dog. Things started getting strange as soon as the dog would start barking a lot in the night and chasing something. Chickens started disappearing through the night and the dog couldn't do anything about it. Probably just some normal predator, but it kind of freaked us out and we left. We eventually found out that the whole village has moved to a nearby valley. They had built new houses. Still don't understand how the whole village made a move at once and didn't even bother to take anything with them. Later, I've heard of that happening in Eastern Europe. Villages were abandoned due to legends of vampires and werewolves. Very superstitious beliefs of these people. My grandpa used to take us mountain biking all through my childhood. One time, it was the middle of the afternoon in a reasonably settled park, asphalt trails, not exactly backwoods, but it was just me, 13 at the time, my 11-year-old brother, and my grandpa. Serene to some, but also very lonely and a little scary. Wolves and bears were commonly sighted. My grandpa suddenly came to a stop on the trail ahead of us and motioned for us to do so, too. There was a fresh, glistening blood trail across the bike path, going up into the woods. Grandpa shushed us and pointed up towards the direction of the blood trail, where something in the woods was moving, but only just so. He didn't go to check it out, but got out his wildlife camera and pointed it into the trees, snapping a few photos with the telephoto lens. Then he got back on his bike, and we continued down the trail. We had so many questions, but he was the resident wildlife expert. If Grandpa got really quiet and kept moving, you did, too. A few weeks later he got the photos developed, this wore the pre-digital era, and showed them to us. A young brown bear had been injured, its leg and stomach severely cut up by some other predator, had dragged itself across the bike trail, and was dying in the woods not more than 50 feet from where we were on our bikes, just barely obscured by the trees. We still biked through the area occasionally on camping trips, but it always had this haunting, melancholy feeling afterwards, that sense of persistent dread, where something has died. On a cross-country road trip, one of our planned stops was a natural bridge in Missouri. We intended to get there mid-afternoon, but wound up arriving at 1 a.m. The park was closed, but the gate was open, and we had been cooped up in the car for too long, so we decided to hike out anyway. Before long, we found the bridge, which was more like a 300-foot tunnel with a creek bed in the bottom. We went in and found another passage intersecting the main tunnel going up and into the rock, and we scrambled up there to see if it went anywhere. It did not. We were on a ledge overlooking the main shaft when we heard voices at the end of the tunnel. Thinking they were park rangers, we decided to kill our lights and hope to stay out of sight. Well, voices kept getting closer, and when we could see their flashlights, we figured we were made, and we figured we'd get in less trouble if we went and talked to them instead of them finding us. So we call out, turn our lights on, and scramble back down to the tunnel. Then we panicked. There was no one there. We checked both ends of the tunnel and we tried to calling out. At this point we really wanted to find a park ranger, but we never found anyone. We then made our way back to the car pretty quick. We have an old family farm in rural eastern Canada with property that includes a field that borders some pretty thick old growth forest. Inside the forest is also a brook where we pick fiddleheads and I identify neat plant species because that's what I do. A few years ago, I was down exploring the forest with my dad and we were walking towards the brook when he veered hard to the right. We could almost see the water directly ahead and it's easy enough to get turned around an old growth forest that you're still exploring, so I thought it was odd we didn't stick to the direction we were walking. I followed him, but asked him about why we didn't keep going the way we were. He said there's a cabin built close to where we had been walking and he wanted to avoid it. I pressed him, and he said it scared him. Now, my father is someone I idolize and I've never seen him act on fear. Example side note, he never learned to swim and nearly drowned as a child, so he developed a fear of deep water. But when I was young he would brave it and help me swim or play in the ocean near the property, so I didn't develop the same fear. When he said the cabin scared him, I got a little prickly and immediately decided to avoid it. Since then, as an adult, I've explored the area around it more thoroughly and it is a creepy cabin in the woods. Windows are dirty so you can't see in, everything rusted and looks abandoned, but then the doorstep is clear as though someone uses it regularly. The cabin is on our property but isn't my family's, and there are other properties close enough to ours that it would take only 10 or 15 minutes to walk off ours and back to someone else's. Hunting isn't big in the area, so it's not that. A creepy cabin is one thing, but having a fearless father admit to being scared by it and actively avoiding it adds to the scare factor surrounding it. Time for a story. Last summer, I was visiting family in Montana with my GF. My aunt and uncle live on a very large property in the middle of nowhere. We all decided to go camping, but my uncle couldn't come and it ended up being me, my GF, and my aunt. I was carrying my AR-15 for protection and possible hunting at the end. We found a little open space to camp in, and my aunt and GF took the tent while I slept at the edge of the clearing in an army sleeping bag. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I'm a very light sleeper, so I figured it was just an animal. But then, I heard something that was not an animal. I heard a low, gravelly voice say there are only 2 in there. There were 3 earlier. At this point, I rolled over quietly and grabbed my AR. A second voice, that almost physically hurt, and sounded just like pure evil, started speaking. That is bad. We will run it down in the morning. Kill these. At that point, I flipped the switch on my light/laser attachment. I saw 2 figures, one about 5 feet high and thickly built, one about 7 to 8 feet high and thin. The shorter one appeared to have black hair and reddish eyes, but the tall one was horrible. It swallowed up the light, I could see nothing but its shape, but I felt its eyes on me. This all took place in less than a second. I, having heard them plan to kill us, opened fire. I fired 3 rounds at the short one, saw it stagger and go backwards, then I fired 5 rounds at the big one. It just disappeared. No sound, nothing. I then fired 5 more at the short one, and it screamed and ran off. My aunt and GF came running out of the tent, and I explained what had happened. My aunt went sheer white, and said, "Oh my God. I felt them in my sleep. They were coming for us. They will be back. We need to leave now." We ran 5 miles in the dark, with pure silence around us, until my aunt would let us stop. I could not, and cannot, get my aunt or uncle to say anything else about that encounter. I have no idea what it was. I have a rather big forest close to my home. Nothing special about it, neither creepy nor mystical and not pretty as well. Just a forest with trees, bushes and so on. I used to go there a lot with my dog since it was so conveniently close and he could run around on its own while I was minding my own business. Around 2 or 3 years ago, I went there rather late, probably around 9 p.m., where it started to get dark soon, but I still wanted to go for a short walk. I always stay on track so I don't disturb any wildlife or damage the plants. As it's getting later and darker, I'm somewhat in the middle of the woods, but I felt all good since I know every small track there and I always would find my way back home. As I'm walking, I hear some weird noises rather close to my left. I couldn't make out what it was, but it sounded like a mixture of hissing and spoken words, but definitely nothing I have ever heard before. It didn't sound like anything earthly, as stupid as that might sound. Then my dog comes bursting out of the bushes, his tail clamped between his legs, totally focused on me and desperate to get going. He knew there was something weird going on. As I try to calm him, I take a look into the woods and there, maybe 20 meters away from me, I see a pair of deep red eyes staring at me. No movement, no blinking or anything, they just stare right at me. I'm struck and somehow can't really move, but I keep staring in those eyes. They were seriously red. I don't know how to describe it, but again, nothing I have seen before. I knew that something was there that didn't belong there, but I don't know what it was. It was like I was dreaming, a very eerie feeling, and the air was dry and crisp as hell, and I felt really calm for some reason and just told my dog to follow me and went away slowly. I never looked back, but I know for sure that if I had looked there, the eyes would still have stared at me. After a couple of meters, I suddenly wake up from my trance and I just hit it. I'm full speed running with my dog through that forest, scared out of my mind, and I'm crying big time while I'm running. I don't even know why, and what really happened, but everything just felt so freaking wrong and I just wanted to get as far away as possible from this place. To this day I don't know what I saw there that night, and I don't think I really want to find out, tbh. The only animals that live in that forest are deer and boars, but the eyes were at human face height, so somewhat between 1.50 meters and 2 meters height. Never stepped foot into that forest again, but I haven't heard from anything weird going on there as well. When I was a young teen, there was a small forest fairly near our house. My neighbor and I would walk to it regularly to go build dens and play on the park near its edge. The land was clearly once part of an estate because it had an old 1900s looking swimming pool and bits of stone path dotted amid the undergrowth. We'd sometimes take other kids there and play chase games or pretend to be tribes people, sprinting through the thick foliage. It was a fun place to explore, especially after we discovered where the stash of crispy old woods porn was. It looked like it was from the 70s. Anyway, we'd been going there for about a year or so at weekends when we finally decided to take a big pair of garden shears to start clearing an area for our biggest den yet. We chose part of the forest that had always been blocked off to us because it was mostly surrounded by a thick wall of bamboo, overgrown from the place's time as an estate, I think. The forest was a paradise just for us. We'd never ever seen anybody there other than us or people we brought. The porn in our dens were always exactly as we left them. But all the same, we figured cutting a secret way into the bamboo-walled area would give the best protected den from strangers and barbarians and ninjas. It took us most of the day to cut our way in. When we'd made an arch to crawl through, we went in to find that we were in a clearing with only clovers growing in it, no taller plants, just a soft blanket of clovers. Dotted throughout were these odd little knee-high statues of fairies sitting on stone mushrooms playing harps and other instruments. Every single one had its face smashed off. In the center of the cramped clearing was a giant concrete-looking block. We kicked over one of the fairy statues on the way over to it, probably to demonstrate that we weren't scared. It was a giant rough stone coffin. Some ivy-like plant covered most of it, but it clearly had a well-defined lid and a worn, unreadable inscription on the side. Adrenaline curious, we tried with all our might to lift the lid, but it must have weighed tons. The adrenaline wore off, we freaked out, and hurriedly walked back through to the play park where we sat and discussed our find for a bit. We decided the clearing was too den perfect to pass up, so the next day we returned with some old metal sheeting and plywood boards to build our shelter. It wasn't raining, but the day was heavily dark and overcast, so the woods were about at the darkest they could be during daytime. We got back into the clearing, started building, and got pretty far with it. After a little while my friend sort of yelped out an "Oh Jesus ducking Christ." I turned to see him stood next to the coffin. It's giving me full body shivers just thinking about this, and it was open. The lid was slid off to one side just enough that a thin person could get through the gap. I ran over, stared into the gap, saw nothing but pitch dark, and whispered "ducking run." The wind rose and it started raining, so there was noise everywhere right at that moment. I've never experienced anything like it. We ran through the wood faster than we'd ever practiced in our tribe games. We never went back into those woods. I live in Utah. I went hiking up on the Bonneville Shoreline Trail that used to be the shore of Lake Bonneville ages ago. This day I picked a different trail to follow, one I'd never been on before. After hiking for a few miles up this trail, I come around a bend and I see two trees that had apparently been uprooted or fallen, and they were placed over the trail in a way that made it look like archway. That by itself wasn't weird, but there were two big elk skulls placed on the end of each tree, placed just so that the empty eye sockets of the skull were looking directly at you as you passed under on the trail. I thought that was kinda weird, but whatever, probably just some people thinking they're funny. I shrugged it off and kept going. But as soon as I passed through the threshold of the archway, a cold chill shot up my spine and I felt my hackles rise instantly and goosebumps all over my body. I kept going for a little while cause I didn't want to go back yet, but the whole time I was walking I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. It had me feeling really tense. I walked for a good 10 minutes before I decided to turn around. As I'm walking back, maybe 5 minutes later, it gets real quiet very suddenly. All the birds stopped chirping, all the little animals around stopped moving. It even seemed like the wind died down at that moment too. Total silence. My dad was a real big hunter when I was younger, so I'm very familiar with the idea that sudden quiet in the wilderness generally equals bad news. By this point I had a white knuckle grip on the hilt of my big survival knife as I kept walking down the trail. I passed through the archway again and honestly broke into a full-on sprint. I didn't see anything, but there was something there. I was being stalked. I could feel the eyes still even as I ran away down the trail. I haven't been back to that trail since that day. I don't know what it was that was stalking me that day, but there was something there and I don't want to find out what. I was hiking through a set of old train tunnels in Colorado with another female friend. When we got to the last, and longest, train tunnel, we both got this horrible feeling that we were being watched. We entered the tunnel, and began walking toward the other side. We kept hearing strange echoes and noises, but we both nervously laughed it off. We had one flashlight between us and, at the middle of the tunnel, it started to die. Right before it went out, we saw this really creepy, white, faceless man-sized doll. It had been stabbed repeatedly where its face and groin would have been. White stuffing was leaking out. We heard loud shuffling behind us. The light went out. We hauled ass and ran to the end of the tunnel. On the way back, we took an alternate route. Neither of us ever went back to that trail. To this day, I have no idea what went on there. Was it a homeless guy? How did the doll get there? That scene was the stuff of nightmares. Camping at Yellowstone/Grand Tetons a few years ago. He set up our camper at an actual site and decided to do some 2-day-long backpack trips in some of the longer trails. The second one we went to was Cascade Valley Canyon. Absolutely beautiful. So get about 10 miles into the 22-mile loop and decide to set up our tent here since it was getting dark. We cook some food and chill for a bit before heading to bed. Around 2 a.m., we're all awakened by something just outside the tent. My mind immediately jumps to bears or wolves or something. Then it starts talking. I will never forget it. I think there's 3 or 4 in the tent. Let's just get out of here. None of us could sleep the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn we hightail it out of there. Made excellent time. Hiked the 12 miles in about 3 hours and got to Ranger Station. Reported what happened. They said they had received a call similar to our story in the middle of the night. They sent rangers into the trail at dawn. Never found out what was going down. Didn't hear of anyone getting hurt, but then again I didn't really look into it. Camping story. A few years ago at the end of high school, me and a few friends decided to go camping in a random neck of the woods well behind one of their houses, a good way up this mountain and far enough from the other homes so that they wouldn't go nuts and call the cops or anything after they saw us carrying tools into the woods. So we all found a spot to stay and set up, though the floor of the forest was angled up because of it being on a mountain. Me and one guy stayed for now to chop up some firewood, while the others went back down to grab food and drinks in the tents, chairs. There's 2 weird things that happened here, one really weird and one extremely weird. Here's the first. While the 2 of us were there chopping up wood, a huge adult deer approached us. We had no food at this point, and assumed it was just foraging. But it didn't. It got uncomfortably close to us, about 5 or 6 feet away even despite the noise of chopping. It sat down low to the ground and stared straight at us. It didn't lower its head to target us with its antlers and seemed oddly calm. Its eyes were also clear, which is a good sign it didn't have something like rabies causing it to act irrationally. Eventually it left, and the others returned with the rest of the stuff about 10 or 15 minutes after. Now, we set up our stuff. All the tents were fairly close together, though mine was furthest up the mountain. We sat by the fire and ate stuff, and also drank. So admittedly, I did have some vodka here, so the rest of the story could just be booze talking. Eventually we put out the flames and went to our tents. It was pretty cold, so I had trouble sleeping despite being in a sleeping bag. And then the second thing happened. I heard this weird sound. My head was at the end of my tent pointed up the mountain. I heard something else, extremely strange. You probably know what it sounds like when something heavy impacts a dirt floor. It's like a dull thumping noise. But these noises started out quiet and far away, and descended the mountain extremely quickly. It sounded like a bipedal stride, with a noticeably wide distance between impacts. I remember looking through the semi-transparent tent material upside down, seeing the silhouettes of the trees growing down into the sky. And there was something tall gliding across the tops of the trees, now making no noise, periodically blocking out the sky between treetops. Eventually there was the sound again, and the bipedal thumps began again, each one noticeably distant from the last. It went sideways across the forest away from us, before ascending. I didn't mention this to anyone else, and they didn't say anything about it either. But that's why I don't go randomly camping in the middle of nowhere. I think the best explanation is probably a bear that freaked out and climbed a tree when it saw our camp, since they can do that quickly, but still. Not really camping, but as kids we lived in a new neighborhood. It was next to about 400 acres of woods and old farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment, and random junk. It was great to grow up there as we spent nearly every day exploring the area. But there was one house off the main road, but about 200 yards into the woods. It looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day, and she came out screaming at us to get the hell off her property. She was scary looking as hell. She wore a dirty dress and had gross stringy hair, and looked like she hadn't taken a shower for years. She looked to be in her 30s. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because we knew that they wouldn't let us play back there anymore. We did go back sometime though. We named her Crazy Mary, and we'd spy on here, and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even then we never got closer than 100 feet from her house. About 10 to 12 years later I am home from college and my mom tells me about how they took this woman to the mental hospital. Apparently she lived there this whole time with her dead mother and father propped up in their chairs in the living room. They figured the parents were dead for 10 to 15 years, but died of natural causes, and Mary had propped them up in the chairs after they died. That meant they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away by Crazy Mary. My parents own a small cabin and some land out in a remote area of Alberta. One day we came across a bunch of Inukshukes, large stones stacked on each other to resemble, in this case, people. They were all dressed up, some in little girl dresses, children's jumpers, safety vests, parkas, some had hats on them, and all of them were seriously creepy. We had no idea where they came from or who put them there. We started making up scary stories around the campfire about this mystery person, and we started pulling pranks on each other. Inukshuk suddenly erected overnight outside of a friend's tent. Lots of scary Blair Witch stuff to freak each other out. My mom went to this social event that the farmers and ranchers in the area put on every year. She mentioned the Inukshuks to an old couple and they told her that their adult son with a variety of mental disorders put those up. Apparently they calm him down and it's very therapeutic for him. It was nice to know that a real person put those up and not evil forest spirits or an axe murderer. I was about 16 or 17, and was a CIT at a summer camp I had went to as a kid and later worked at. The other trainees and I were treated to an evening in Portland, Maine, and had begun the walk from the vans to our tents. We were pretty secluded from the rest of the camp, living in large tents at the edge of a huge open field. We had just come out of the woods into the field when we see a flash light coming towards us. It was pretty late, and the rest of the camp was sleeping aside from a few counselors who were hanging out in the front office. Everyone that had any business being in that field was with us, so we had no clue who would be wandering in the field with a light. We call out to the light trying to figure out who it is. We get no response, and it continues to approach us as we're heading back to the tents. We call out a few more times with no response. It wasn't until the light was about 6 feet away from us that I started to get freaked out. We stopped moving, and so did the flashlight. Keep in mind that we all had flashlights as well, but the light was too bright for us to be able to see beyond it. After a few tense seconds the light goes out. We all had our flashlights trained in the light's direction already, and we all scanned the area to find that there was no one there. We were in the middle of a wide open field, and the light was very close to us before turning off, so there was no place for someone to hide from us. Many of us also had our own flashlights that were trained on the light from the second we first saw it to the point of it disappearing. We all stood there for a few seconds searching for the source before quickly realizing that we were the only ones in the field and trucking it back to our tents. I'm not saying I saw a ghost or anything, but to this day I don't know what we saw. My dad used to go camping at his grandfather's as a kid. Now there were bears in the area, but Grandpa didn't take no shit. My dad had watched this man chase off bears with a pitchfork. One night they headed to the tree line for firewood and caught some eyes flicker in the flashlight beam. No big deal. Except they were around 12 feet off the ground, and although they couldn't make out the details, the thing was massive. And even though bears will stand on their hind legs, my dad said something just felt off and there was a terrible putrid smell that suddenly appeared. His grandpa fired a shot off but it didn't even flinch. Then it roared. My dad said it sounded like a lion's roar mixed with a woman screaming, but its head didn't seem to move. At this point my grandfather told my father to duck and run, but his voice was so shaky and choked it took him 2 tries to get the words out. They booked it back to the house over a mile away, which was impressive for the 70-ish-year-old man. My dad said his grandfather was white as sheet and was shaking for the next couple hours. They heard the howl one more time an hour or so later. My dad said they never camped out there again. Also understand that my dad isn't one to make things up. My aunts and grandma have a horrible habit of lying. As such, he hates lies, to the point he has refused to help me with practical jokes that required even the smallest white lie. I am a girl who has worked at Boy Scout camps for 7 years during the summers and winters. While I personally didn't find anything, I always had this sense of unease at night on the camp I worked at for 6 of those 7 years. One of the guys I was working with claimed to be spiritually sensitive and said there was actually a lot of activity in the woods by the female staff's campsite. Lots of the girls heard growling and claimed they saw creepy things. No, it wasn't the boys either. Don't even get me started on a semi-exorcism some guys did on a staff member. He didn't know about it at first but instantly started behaving much happier and more relaxed the next day. Or the condemned fire ring. Summary on the fire ring: Satanists sacrificed a dead cat and drew a pentagram. Even a scene from Friday the 13th was filmed on one of our bridges. In conclusion, that Boy Scout camp is almost definitely haunted by ghosts/demons, and due to my experiences I can no longer sleep without every door closed and a little bit of light. Not walking, but mountain biking. I have a couple of LED lights for night riding, a wide floodlight on my handlebars and a narrow beam spotlight on my helmet. I'm in Florida, and was riding through a swampy jungle when I noticed the trail was covered with these little, sparkly, emerald green shiny things. I assumed they were crystals like quartz or something, except that the trails are mostly sand and shouldn't have anything like that. So I decided to stop and see what the reflection was, and it was light reflecting back from the eyes of a giant wolf spider. Arg! The trail is covered with spiders. Literally hundreds and hundreds of them. And those are only the ones facing me. Another time on the same trails, I was flying down a long straightaway and up ahead I can see a pair of eyes on the trail reflecting back at me. They were low to the ground, so I thought they were a raccoon or a possum or something. As I got closer, they started to rise up. And up. And up some more, until they were, it seemed, as tall as a person. Just as the creature got into range of my spotlight, it turned around and bolted into the trees. I only saw its back in my spotlight for a moment, but whatever it was big and covered in medium brown hair. I'm guessing it was a deer, but I'm not sure and I wasn't sticking around to find out. My dad's family is from the American Southwest, an area called the Llano Estacado. It's got a pretty rich history now that I think of it. It looks like a barren desert, but the area is chock full of dinosaur bone discoveries, Stone Age people, and, more recently, it's where the conquistadors traveled through. Anyway, I guess maybe 40 years ago my grandpa bought some land and built a house out there, 45 minutes away from any other town. They ran cattle on the land, and the first summer my dad was way out in a pasture by himself at the age of 15. He lived in a school bus that had been converted a bit to be a little camper. Had a bed and stuff. He was basically a shepherd for a young crop of calves. There was no electricity and he only saw his family once a week when grandpa would drive out there to pick him for church on Sunday mornings. Bus didn't run, it was just a shelter. My dad doesn't talk about it too much. One time he opened up about it. He and I were helping a farmer with his wheat crop and we were taking a break, talking. He said he killed at least one rattler every day. At night, he could feel lots of tiny feet of the mice running over him in his bunk. He would lay on the hood of the bus and read Louis L'Amour books till the sun went down. It sounded so cool to me, like from a different time or world. I couldn't imagine being alone that much. He had no phone either, obviously. Anyways, as you might surmise from this story, my dad grew up to be a pretty tough character. He's the strongest man I know mentally and physically. He's a vet, runs a mechanic shop and rides motorcycles all across the country. He doesn't put up with bull or nonsense. He's a religious man, but I've never known him to be anything other than serious, realistic, unsuperstitious, except for the superstition of heaven and God, but you see what I mean. So when he looked down at the ground that day we were talking, scuffed his boot, and said he knew there were ghosts out there, I was shocked. I asked what he meant, and he said just ghosts of the past. After another pause he said one night 3 skeletons ran through his campsite. He gave no more details and has never repeated the words since. But he said he would take me out there if I wanted to go. We still lived in the area, so that evening we knocked off work early and drove out there. Now the house is long since gone. There's an Air Force base nearby and they have a bombing range out there now. After my grandpa built the house, they extended the bombing range and they were forced off the land. Built a big pit and bulldozed the house into it. Needless to say, trespassers aren't welcome. But my dad wanted to show me the old bus, and this was near the edge of the range. The area is not patrolled or anything. Most people have the common sense to see the words bombing range and stay out. But they hardly fly out there and practice bombing every day. You can hear them when they do, and that day had been quiet, so we drive out there as far as we can and then got out of the truck and started walking. There was no one around for miles. We get to the old bus around sunset. I remember the feel of the place. Maybe it was my imagination from what my dad had said, but it felt strange. I can't find the words for it. It just felt different from anywhere I'd ever been. Not creepy exactly, but heavy? If that makes sense? I went into the old bus and opened a cabinet. Damn near had a heart attack. There was a screeching cry and batting wings as a large owl took flight into my face. I screamed and hit the deck. Have you seen the talons or beaks on these guys? But the owl made a U-turn and went out a rusted hole in the back of the cabinet. Inside though was a truly gruesome sight. There were 3 baby owlets inside. There were owl pellets everywhere, the regurgitated bones of rodents and the like. It stunk. And these babies, mind you, were not cute. Scraggly and covered in greasy clumps of matted feathers in some places, and bald red skin in others. And they were gathered around the corpse of the 4th owlet, pecking it and tearing pieces of meat off. Cannibal owls? No, thanks. Exiting the bus, my dad showed me an old grain pit. He lifted the old wood boards covering it and tossed a rock inside. A chorus of rattling met our ears. Couldn't see inside, but it was full of rattlesnakes. I backed off so fast and still shudder at the Indiana Jones type nightmare that would have ensued if those boards gave way and I was dropped inside. The last strange thing we saw was a single cactus. It was unlike any cactus I have ever seen anywhere, before or since. Out there we have jumping cactus, yucca, pricklies, and maybe a barrel cactus or 2, no seguros. This was none of those types and was definitely not native. It had grown large and sprawling, twisted green growth covered in tines. It had the most brilliant blood red flowers. We set off back to the truck after that. The sun was dropping. I know this story isn't on par with the more scary ones on here, but altogether it was one of the most eerie experiences I ever had. It didn't make sense when he said, but I think I get what my dad meant now by ghosts of the past. Years ago when my grandma passed away, we had to go one side of the US. To the other ASAP for the funeral. Well, we got to Oklahoma real late one night of the drive and my folks stopped at the only motel available. Don't remember the name or place, but it was like Timo forgot it or something, old cabin log buildings, and it backed up to a forest area that had initially been partly cleared to make the road connect to the interstate. Didn't happen and nature was reclaiming the road slowly. Well, my folks went to sleep and my brother and I went for a walk down path that was semi-asphalt and semi-overgrowth. It led to a dead end where you could see the highway about a mile away in the dark. We walked about a mile max and smoked a joint on the way. Well, my brother said time to head back and we started off, and me being a lightweight started chuckling and chatting on the walk back. He grabbed my arm hard as shit and looked in my face serious AF, and we kept walking all the while making eye contact with me and darting his eyes left to right and walking quick but not running. We made it to the clearing at the motel parking area and I walked up to the nearest stairs and jogged up and looked down and saw my brother staring at a humongous white wolf thing. He walked backward slowly and the thing eventually trotted off like a horse, it was that big. It was super mangy and had her patches missing and could tell it was hungry as shit. We probably made it back just in time. We still talk about to this day nearly 20 years later. BTW, my bro is tough as nails and I'm dedicated and hardworking but kinda a pushover in the outdoorsman area. My friends and I love to urban explore around our hometown of New Orleans, in high school/early college. And by that, I mean we just hop in the car and drive with no destination, end up somewhere interesting looking, then get out and walk around. I've got a couple of stories, but this one still stands out in my mind. One night, a friend of a friend took us to a secret beach which required walking over a hill past these train tracks, then through a small patch of woods. It was a small, sandy beach, with overturned trees as benches. It had a view of the Mississippi River, and you could watch the large riverboats running up and down it. There were signs of people having been back there at some point, there was trash scattered about. But we thought it was so cool, and started a little fire pit out there and everything. He then told us about a ship graveyard that was a short hike through the woods. He showed us the way and it was so neat. You trek through this footpath, then climb up this large dirt hill with giant pieces of metal jutting out of it to get back to the main attraction. It was basically the corpses of old ships in all manners of positions, as well as multitudes of old, large shipping crates. It seemed maybe, at one point, it was some kind of docking station but had since long been abandoned. In the dead center of it was a small building, looked as if it had been an office or something. Then there was a large metal structure made of tubes near a huge overturned ship. The ship had sunk into the mud and the front end was sticking straight up into the sky. It was wild. We walked around and noticed some of the crates were open, but none of us went to look inside. There was also graffiti on some of them, plus the building in the middle, which read the rabbit hole and had a bunny tagged on it. After maybe half an hour of walking around, we climbed out of the ship graveyard, walked back to the secret beach, smoked a couple cigarettes and then went home. A few months later, a tropical storm hit. The following weekend, I wanted to impress this girl I liked at the time, and suggested our group of friends hanging out that night go back to the beach, since most of them hadn't seen it. We went back and it was almost totally reconstructed, just from the tropical storm. The log seats were moved about, the fire pit we had built was gone, and the path to the ship graveyard was a mess of debris and fallen trees/branches. We hung out on the beach and I asked the group if they wanted to go see the ship graveyard. We had to take a weird, alternate route through the woods from the normal path, because the main footpath was still flooded over. We got to the back and the climb up the dirt hill was a trek. It was sloppy and muddy and the metal struts to climb in were sliding around. It was much more difficult than before. But we made it to the other side and everyone was astounded, and we walked around a bit. We found these giant fire extinguishers and they worked. We sprayed them around and they were loud. We ended up walking over to the rabbit hole building and one of my friends climbed to the roof of it to see if there was a way inside. Almost as soon as he reached the top, he quickly scaled down and came back around and whispered someone is back here with us. And pointed toward the metal tube structure next to the overturned ship. And sure enough, there was someone tall, large, rocking back and forth on the tube structure. Then we noticed there was a blanket or something hanging from the ship, as if he had climbed up and was squatting there. The girl I was trying to impress was suddenly very unimpressed and we made our way back to the dirt hill. We turned around and both the person and the blanket were gone. We proceeded to freak the duck out, and started to move faster. As we got to the top of the hill, we could see him walking past the rabbit hole. A few of us got cuts and scrapes trying to climb the metal structures in the mud, but we were so in a panic, we didn't even notice till later. We went the original way we came, away from the foot route, and I don't think any of us had ever felt a walk took that long to get back. We only whispered to each other as we moved, and when we got back to the beach, we took off past the train tracks, got into my car, and peeled off. To this day, I'm not sure who was back there or why they were silently following us out, but it definitely was terrifying. We never went back.